11:05. So let's get started. We are going to do normal forms trainings again back on Wednesdays, every Wednesday at 11 o'clock where there is not an office meeting. That is the intention. Kind of going over some of those car forms is the plan. Our big one today, though, is we're going to talk about, we're not necessarily covering, we're talking about the forms that were implemented back in, what was that, August, right? So it's mid-September now. It's been about a month since we've been supposed to be using these new forms for everything. So hopefully everyone's using them and is comfortable. Before we get started, does anybody have any specific questions with related to the BRBC or any of the related forms? And I do have the chat box open as well, so you can feel free to like raise your hand, unmute yourself and interrupt me, or just throw your questions in the chat box. Any of those methods work. Any questions before we hop in? Alrighty. When it comes to our buyer representation agreement, we have two options now. We have our longer term one. I'm hesitant to say long term because it's really only 3 months. We're only allowed to max it at 3 months at a time and then you can do an extension. Or we have our temporary one, right? That is only for 3 properties or 30 days. And it's not 3 properties and 30 days. It's one or the other. Once you've hit 3 properties, that one then expires. Or once we hit 30 days, if we haven't seen 3 properties, then it expires. So there's the temporary one as well. It's called the PSRA. That one is, just a second. It's the property showing and representation agreement. So where would I use this form? I would use this form anywhere where we're maybe interacting with a cold market lead. We haven't had the opportunity to build relationship with them yet. Maybe they were a sign call, maybe it's a Zillow lead, maybe it's an open house lead, right? And they want you to go show them some more properties. So remember that we need to have this form signed, some sort of representation agreement before we show a property to anybody. We should not be showing properties to people without having one of these 2 forms signed, either the PSRA or the BRBC, okay? So the PSRA, again, it's not exceeding 30 days, and you don't have to make it 30 days. It could be, hey, we're just going to put this in effect for this weekend for the properties that you want to see while you're in town, or whatever that might be. So those people that maybe we don't have relationship with, and it also exceeds right here, you've got 3 properties only, okay? So those are your options there. This is just a little less intimidating per se than like the BRBC. So if you've got those cold leads, we don't have relationship with you yet, we have to have something signed to go walk them through the door. This might be your best option because it's not quite as involved and long term, okay? So that would be the PSRA. The nice thing about this is that by having people sign something, especially I know those of you that work for Zillow or with Zillow, not for, but with Zillow, I know there was a whole slew of buyers there for a while. I was talking with lots of the Zillow team, and they would they would ask them if they're working with another agent. No, I'm not. Perfect. Let's go see the property. And then they would go see the property and come back and say, oh, actually, my sister is an agent and she's going to write the offer for me. So make sure you've got something in place, right? Legally, we have to have one of these 2 documents signed to go show properties. Make sure you do that. And this kind of should help to circumvent those buyers that are trying to cheat the system. They're trying to get into a property to see it without actually using that agent to write the offer. This should kind of flush those people out, or at least get you paid if they decided to write it with somebody else. Okay. So this property showing and representation agreement, it is like only 3 pages, I believe, 3 pages. The third one's just signature. So it's really only 2 pages. Again, a little less intensive. We're just going to fill in at the top the properties that we're going to go see. If you're going to go see more than 3 properties, we have to use the other form. Okay, I've had that question in the past. Here's the representation period. You're going to fill in the amount of compensation. This right here, B2, outlines that if they receive compensation from the seller, right, the amount's going to be credited against prospective buyer's obligation. So it outlines that right here, right underneath where you would fill in the compensation. And then also says that, hey, broker's not going to receive any amount in excess of 4B1, because that used to be the old way of doing things. We used to get the excess of whatever we put there. If it were me, I personally would put in what my time and value is worth right here, the top end of that, and let the buyer know that we can renegotiate based on what the seller is willing to pay if the seller is unwilling to pay the full amount, right? So I would shoot for the moon, and hope that we fall somewhere in that range rather than putting the lowest on there and then leaving money on the table. So that's just me. Again, there's no specific percent there. There's no industry standard. There's no requirement from Realty One Group on what you put on this line. This is what you value your time, energy, and effort at goes on that percentage. And then you always have the option of a percentage and an additional amount, or you could just go flat rate. Okay, so if we fill in a percentage here, and then check this first box and put in a number here, like let's say 500, then it's going to be whatever the percentage is plus 500. Okay. If we don't fill anything in there and we check this next box, then it's the it's instead of the percentage, right? So this is percentage and now we're going or. This is going to be a flat rate. Okay. So that may come into play. Maybe you've got a buyer looking at $2 million properties and you're like, hey, I'm happy making $20,000 on whatever property you end up buying. We could put in a flat rate there. I recently had a really low purchase price. It was like $57,000. I don't know if you've done the math on what 3% is of $57,000 or 2% or 5%. But it's not a whole lot of money. So I put in a flat rate there for the offer on that property. Okay, so just kind of keep those in mind. You have lots of options there. If we put in an amount here, or we put this amount in on the BRBC and the seller agrees to pay less than what that amount is, and the buyer doesn't have the money to come up with the difference, or you don't want to make your buyer come up with a difference, maybe you put X% here and the seller's willing to pay Y, and you're like, really, Y is sufficient. We can modify this. The correct way and the only way to modify this is with a modification of the buyer representation form. So that's going to be your disclosure and, oh, no, that's not it. Dun, da, da, da. Hold on. Somewhere here. Modification of terms, buyer representation agreement. Okay, right here. So they have a specific form to modify that. That's where you would do any modifications to that form. Reduction, increase in commissions. This is how we would extend the expiration date. Again, we can't extend the expiration date of the PSRA. You would roll over then to a BRBC. So once we hit 3 properties or 30 days, if we're going to continue working with that buyer, we need to move them to a BRBC, not modify the PSRA. Yes, Michelle, this is going to work for either the BRBC or the PSRA. We can utilize this form here. Okay, buyer representation agreement. It doesn't specify which form, so we can use either or. Okay, we can modify that compensation or any other terms that are on there. Okay, so that's that modification. This is between the buyer. I've seen some people that have tried to modify some of these forms with an addendum or an amendment. So either an AD or an AEA, not the correct way, because those are between the buyer and the seller, not buyer and agent representation. Okay, so the only one that modifies that is this modification of terms. So any changes need to be on the modification of terms. Any questions so far? Okay, the BRBC is a little bit more involved. It's got like 10 pages, I want to say. Let's see. Oh, 5. It's 5 pages. I'm a liar. It's 5, but it also has all the documents ahead of it and behind it, right? So it's got like your agency disclosure and then all the documents at the tail end that have to be signed. This one can go up to 3 months. So remember, they changed that in August, that our representation period cannot exceed 3 months. So again, and just so you know, if it does exceed 3 months, it makes the whole thing void. So don't make that error. If we're getting up to that expiration date of 3 months, we want to turn around and then extend it. Again, we're going to use that modification of terms buyer representation agreement form, that MT dash, I believe it's BR. Okay. Be as complete as possible in this upper section, what you're going to fill out for what properties they're interested in. And I would use the additional buyer preference and priorities form. Okay. If you're not familiar with that one, it looks like this. It's the BIPP form, and it allows your buyer to fill out what kind of properties they are interested in. Okay, so this is that same, and then I wouldn't just have them fill it out and then stick it in the file and forget about it, or have them fill it out and then start doing searches based on this information. I would recommend having a conversation with your buyer about this form, right? Okay, I see here that you put in the price range that you're looking for properties up to 650,000. Is that the top end of what you're pre-approved for? Or do you know what your pre-approved, what your max pre-approval is? Oh yeah, we're actually only pre-approved for 600,000, right? Or, oh yeah, we're approved up to 800,000, but that 650 number, that's really where our payment's comfortable, right? Perfect. Or it may be, I see that you put 650,000 here. What's important to you about keeping their home purchase under 650,000? Right? That what's important to you is a really good question to utilize to dig further into your buyer's wishes and desires, right? Property use. Oh, I see here you're going to use it as a second home. So you already have a primary residence. Oh yeah, our primary home, it's in Scottsdale, Arizona, but we want to go back and forth because our daughter's going to school at UC Davis. So we want a second home here that we can come visit with her, and she's going to rent it from us as well, right? Or, oh, I want income producing, right? So whatever that is, single family, condo, manufactured, property features. Okay, I see here that you put 5 bedrooms. What's important to you about 5 bedrooms? Or what does finding a house or purchasing a home with 5 bedrooms do for you and your family? Right? What does that do for you and your family? Because now we're digging into the meaning and the intention behind that, because you might find out that, oh, well, we really need 3 bedrooms, and then we want one space to be able to like create a workout room, and then I also work from home, so I need a space, an office space in the house as well. Oh, perfect. So we're not limited necessarily to, we don't necessarily need 5 rooms with closets, which is what would symbolize a bedroom. If we had a 3 or 4 bedroom home with a bonus room or a additional unit or space available to it, would that work for you? Oh yeah, absolutely, right? Because now we've just broadened our search, because there's so many homes now that are like 3 or 4 bedrooms that have office rooms or a bonus space, or what they call flex space, right? That may work for those buyers. So we've increased our search parameters to be able to accommodate what their needs were. And if we would have just gone off the form and they said 5 bedrooms, now we know. And maybe they put 5 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms, and you're like, oh, well, what's important to you about those 5 bedrooms? Oh, well, you know, my wife's family is going to come live with us, and they're kind of disabled. So we actually need one of those bedrooms. If the house is 2-story, we need one on the bottom level. Oh my gosh, clarity, right? We just gained so much clarity by asking that question of what their needs are in a house, so that we can make sure to send them properties that meet those needs versus the ones that don't. So make sure that we're going through this and answering that question. Minimum square footage, right? Single story, multi-level, corner lot, yard. Do they want grass, drought tolerant, pool? Do they want solar? Are they specific to a school district? Do they need any accessibility or disability features? Do they have any preferences on cities or counties, and any other feature, right, that they find would be helpful? So this form, even if you don't have them fill it out, even if you walk them through it during your buyer consultation appointment, I would absolutely utilize this form. I think it's a fabulous form, and it gets to the heart of what the buyer is looking for. Okay, it also gives you a point to get into their why and keep them motivated on moving forward into a property. Michelle's question is the BIPP an optional form or mandatory? It is absolutely optional on your buyer representation agreement. Up here on the grid, on the BRBC, we're almost there. All right, on this BRBC right here, it's a box that you would check on section, I think that's 2C. Okay, if we don't check that box, it's not attached, but if we check the box, we use the form. Okay, so absolutely not a requirement. Let's see here. Raquel's question is if we use the MTBR form, so let's say that the client is going to purchase new construction and we put X% on the BRBC, but new construction is actually offering more than what we put on that BRBC, you absolutely could use a modification of terms for the increase in compensation. Okay, and you may want to make it too, with that modification of terms, if you're doing it in that case, it may be if buyer purchase in the modification of terms, we may want to put on other terms. If buyer purchases a property from Sino Homes in Dixon, California, total agent compensation to be X%, right? So that way we didn't increase the full percentage on the whole BRBC. We only increased it for that specific community, so that the buyers feel comfortable increasing that commission based on what's being provided by that new home community. All right, good questions. Thank you for asking, both of you. I appreciate it. All right, so that's that BIPP form. Yeah, perfect. If there's properties excluded from representation, you would put them here or attached list, amount of compensation, payments. Again, right here under the compensation line, this has the same options as the PSRA did, the percentage, and, or you can just go with a flat rate on the or this one gives you an additional one. You've got an attached compensation schedule. So you can utilize that as well. So maybe you've got it drawn out that if the property is below 100,000, I take this amount. If it's between 100 and 900,000, I take this amount. And if it's over 900,000, I take Y, right? So you may have a compensation schedule built into that, and you always attach it so they can see how that all works. And you could even break it down further than that. You could be like, well, for, properties under 100,000, I take A. For properties between 100 and 500,000 or 100 and 600,000, I take B. For 600 to a million, I take C, right? So it could actually be like I don't know what the opposite of like graduated is, but where it reduces as the purchase price goes up. So, right? So you could do all sorts of fun things there in that. So you can do a compensation schedule, but otherwise the same. And same thing here under E2, same statement that was in the PSRA, that if you receive compensation from the seller or anybody else for the representation of buyer, the amount should be credited against the buyer's obligation to pay. Okay. This continued right to payment for broker involved properties. Keep in mind, if you write something in here, this only applies that if the BRBC expires. Okay, it does not come into play when it is canceled. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. This is for the continuation period in case you have questions about that. C4C is where you would find that information, which is right here. You're entitled to compensation provided for in 2E1 during the continuation period specified in 2E3. Buyer enters into the agreement to acquire property for which there is broker involvement. Broker's right to compensation pursuant to the paragraph to only apply if prior to the expiration of the agreement or any extension, broker delivers buyer a written notice of those properties for which there was broker involvement, okay, on the MBIP form. Okay, so it doesn't apply to cancellation, it's just expiration. All right, cancellation right, non-exclusive cancellation. I usually instruct everybody to mark the exclusive box up here on A2, that it's exclusive, which means that during this representation period, any properties they make an offer on, you're due a commission for that. If it's non-exclusive, what happens is the buyer may be using Raquel to see a couple properties. They may have talked to Michelle about showing them a couple others. They may be talking with Vanessa to see a couple others. And whichever property they ended up writing an offer on, whoever showed them that property gets compensated. So they can basically, it'd be the same idea as like sleeping around. Okay. you're not in a relationship with them. But if you help them find the property that they finally decide to make an offer on, you will get compensated for your efforts there. Okay, that would be non-exclusive. Thank you, Michelle. Household, yes, thank you. So that's how non-exclusive works. I would always recommend checking that exclusive box, meaning that, hey, during this representation period, any properties that you're interested in, I'm due the commission. Hey, I told you that if you want to go see new properties to let me know, because I'll schedule that appointment and go with you for that to make sure that you're represented during that time period. Buyer's like, oh, well, we were in the neighborhood, we stopped by, and now we're in contract. You're like, great, you still owe me a commission. Okay, so that's how that works. All right. So that being said, with the cancellation rights, the cancellation is effective 30 days after receipt. So it kind of has this built-in period that, hey, you've submitted your cancellation within 30 days after receipt. That's when the cancellation's actually effective. Okay. So it just sets you up to make sure that they don't go around you to cancel it and then make an offer on another property. The next form here that it talks about in G1, the BFPI, that would be a required form per the new BRBC. Okay. And that is the buyer financial and personal information form. Okay. So now that's up on the screen there. This one is required. It's either 5 days after they sign the BRBC would be within that time period that it would be required, or with it, I would just have them fill out with it so that you're upfront and honest and we know what's going on with our buyers. You're going to put the representation period in there. How much of the deposit do you have available, right? Oh, how many of us don't ask that question up front? Now we're sitting down to write an offer and you're like, this is what the customary deposit is. And they're like, oh my gosh, we don't have that kind of money in our account. We're doing 100% financing because we're using FHA and down payment assistance and closing cost assistance, or we're getting all the money from our 401k, we're borrowing it. We don't have that money available right now, right? So how much deposit do you have available? That makes the conversation a lot less awkward when we go to write the offer. How much down payment do they have available, right? How much are they putting down? If they thought their purchase price was going to be 650,000 with 3.5% down, do they at least have the amount of down payment readily available? Or are they like, oh, actually, like we don't have any of our down payment available. It's all coming from a 401k. So it's going to take a little bit to make that transfer. Or, oh my gosh, yeah, I'm expecting a inheritance and I haven't received it yet. So we are going to put 20% down, but we don't have those funds available quite yet. Right? Good conversations to have with our buyers before we go show properties. I'm telling you, it'll save you time, energy, and effort. Perfect. Let's wait to go show properties until you actually have that inheritance money in hand, only because I don't want you to go see a property today that you fall in love with, and then we're not able to move forward with writing an offer on it because the funds aren't available and we're not exactly sure where when you're getting those. Does that make sense? Oh my gosh, yeah, absolutely, right? Sources of down payments and deposit. Is it cash in the bank? Is it a retirement account, gift, loan, assistance program, sale of existing property? Is it already sold, already in contract, not yet listed? What great questions. If they're like sale of an existing home, oh yeah, it's not listed yet. Perfect. Where is it? Well, it's around the corner. Are you talking with an agent to list that house? No, we haven't done that yet. Oh my gosh, I can handle that as well. Right now we just picked up 2 transactions for the price of 1. Additional amount of additional funds available for broker compensation and closing costs. Right? This would be a good conversation to be like, on average, your closing costs are going to be X%. On top of that, my commission is going to be Y. Now, in most cases, I'm able to negotiate that the seller is going to cover that commission, but not always. So what kind of, do you have those funds available for your closing costs and for commission in case it becomes necessary? Right? Source of additional funds. Where are those coming from? Savings, retirement account, gift, loan, assistance programs, right? Maximum loan amount. What do you want your max purchase price to be, or max loan amount versus purchase price, right? Who's their lender? Are they pre-qualified, pre-approved, fully underwritten pre-approval? In case you're like me and you always get confused over what's pre-qualified versus pre-approved. We just go to the next line on fully underwritten pre-approval. Okay, so a pre-approval is where the banks actually reviewed their income and asset documentation. They've pulled credit. They've had a conversation with these buyers. versus pre-qualified is, hey bank, this is what I say I make, this is what I say I have in the bank, and I'm pretty sure my credit score is about a 750. Can I get pre-approved for a home? Oh yeah, based on the information you told us, here is the home that you would qualify for. Perfect, thank you, that's pre-qualified. Please don't go show pre-qualified buyers homes. Okay, oftentimes what happens with that is you go to write the offer and then you submit it, it gets accepted, you're moving through the loan process, and all of a sudden the bank goes, oh my gosh, well, they said this and that and the other, and that wasn't actually true. And now we can't actually lend on this buyer, and you have to cancel that contract. So it should be pre-approved, not pre-qualified, or fully underwritten. Fully underwritten means it's been submitted to the bank for review, and the underwriter has actually looked at that file. We already know what the conditions are going to be for that buyer. Okay. Let's see here. Financing type. What kind of financing are they using? Maximum monthly housing expense for PITI and HOA fees. Okay. If you're like, oh my gosh, Amy, what is PITI? It's a term we used to use all the time. A lot of agents don't even know what it means anymore, but it's principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. Okay, so what is their full payment going to be, including the principal and interest? So they're fully amortized, monthly payment, including their homeowner's insurance estimate and their tax estimate, divided by 12 on a monthly basis. PITI, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. What's the most amount that they want to pay for their housing costs on a monthly basis? Okay. Is it a 1031 exchange? Are they going to have a contingency to sell another property? What's their current housing information, property ownership experience, real estate related experience, time constraints, reason for purchase, other. This might even be like a great questionnaire to like send out before your buyer presentation, and actually have them complete as homework ahead of time. So that way you can be having these conversations. I would send this one and maybe that, let's see, this one's the BIPP form that we talked about earlier, the buyer's preference. You could send that out to them ahead of time, say, hey, fill these out and bring them with you to our meeting so that we can discuss what it is that you're looking for in a home. Right? Then we have all that information up front. Then we go through the BRBC. The good news is if you get your buyers to fill out homework before they even sit down with you for that buyer presentation, their chances of signing that BRBC are going to be so much higher because they've already done work for you. They don't want to have to start over with somebody else. Okay, so that's that BFPI form. So technically this one is required based on the information in that BRBC. Okay, it tells us that it's either going to be delivered within 5 days, somewhere right here. It's either going to be delivered within 5 days from the execution of this agreement, or that it's attached. Okay, the other financial considerations here on G2, buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay broker, or buyer intends to purchase with the following loan product, which does not allow buyer to pay compensation to broker. So, right, we want to know upfront that the buyer isn't going to be able to pay us, because it may change what properties we choose to show that buyer, or how we handle the showing of properties up front. We may need to have conversations with the listing agents ahead of time to ask them if their sellers are willing to pay compensation or pay concessions to the buyer. Okay. So that's your BRBC in a nutshell. Again, if we want to modify the BRBC or that PSRA, which is the temporary one, we want to do that with a modification of terms of the buyer representation agreement. Okay, that's how we would modify it, how we would change timeframes, do an extension of the BRBC, change commissions, anything like that we would do on that. If we want to cancel it, we would use the cancellation of buyer representation. And if you're having a difficult time getting buyers to sign a BRBC, and you want them to feel comfortable and confident that they can cancel it at any time, we may want to include the cancellation form for them up front, where they get a copy of it they can take home. And we may want to pre-fill it out to how we would agree to cancel that contract, and let them know that, hey, It says right here that you can cancel this, and I want to make sure that you feel comfortable in knowing that you can cancel that, right? Because here's the buyer's main concern is, I just not sure I want to get locked into using one agent, right? Well, perfect. Well, legally, we can't even show you homes without having it signed. So you're going to have to sign it with somebody. But what I'm going to do, which nobody else is going to do for you, is I'm actually going to give you a copy of this cancellation. So if at any time you decide this relationship is not working out, right? You can just sign this, send it over to me, and that's the terms in which it'll be canceled on. No harm, no foul. I'll provide you a list of the properties for which I had broker involvement on. If you decided to move forward with any of those properties that we had seen during the representation period, I would still be due a commission. I'm happy to represent you on those, but I'm also happy to send you on to another agent, right? For your purchase moving forward. So we could always do that ahead of time so that they feel comfortable and confident that it's not just lip service, that we're serious about their ability to be able to cancel that agreement and what the terms of those cancellations would be and how that would affect them moving forward, right? No sense in like, shimmying around the area, not having that conversation. Give them that confidence up front that you're willing to do what you say. Okay, so that's that cancellation of buyer representation form. Any questions about the BRBC, the PSRA, the BIPP, the BFPI, the modification of terms, the MT form, or the cancellation of representation, the COBRA form, COBR? Okay, so once we have that BRBC signed, and only once we have the BRBC signed, then we can write an offer on a property and ask the seller on the buyer's behalf to cover the compensation using a SBPP form. Okay, seller's payment for buyer's broker's compensation. Okay, so keep this in mind, and it's all about mindset, right? We used to have cooperating broker compensation where we oftentimes got paid by the buyers or by the listing brokerage. Okay, we weren't being paid by the seller. We were being paid by the listing brokerage. The total commission was going to the listing brokerage. The listing brokerage was agreeing to pay us a cooperating broker compensation. That's no longer in existence. We now have where the buyer wants us to negotiate on their behalf with the seller for the seller to pay our commission. Okay, that's what we're doing. So in case you ever look at like the code of ethics, the NAR code of ethics that talks about the fact that we can't interfere with the compensation, the listing agent's compensation or another agent's compensation, that's why this doesn't violate that term in the code of ethics, because we're not interfering with that compensation between the listing agent and the seller. We are working for the buyer to negotiate the seller to cover the buyer's portion of that, just like we would work to negotiate for them to cover closing costs. Same idea. Okay, so here we're going to do, this is all part of the purchase agreement, the property address. You're going to put in the buyer's names. You're going to put in the seller's names. You're going to put in our brokerage. You're going to put in the seller's brokerage, right? Here's the amount here, subject to paragraph 1B, which is down below. Seller agrees to pay buyer's broker X% of the purchase price, and if any X, or if checked blank, right? So this matches what is on that BRBC form. So we're either going to have a percentage, we're going to have a percentage and a little amount here, or we're going to check this box and it's just going to be a flat rate, not a percentage. Okay, so same options as the BRBC. Oftentimes, this is going to match our BRBC. Okay, there may be times where our BRBC says X percentage. We had a conversation with the listing agent. The listing agent told us that the seller is willing to pay Y compensation, which is less than what the buyer has agreed to pay. And the buyer says, yeah, I'm good coming up with that extra 0.5% or that extra percent. So this amount might be less than what's on the BRBC in the case that we're only asking the seller to cover a portion of it. Okay, so keep that in mind as well. This does not have to match the BRBC. It cannot exceed the BRBC if we don't have a modification of terms in place for the change in the commission. Okay. Anna, do you have a question?
No, sorry.
Oh, you're fine. I just wanted to make sure. Maximum
Thank you.
seller pay, no problem. Maximum seller payment obligation. It can't exceed what's on the BRBC. Okay, bottom line there. Buyer representation regarding compensation, right? This says that, hey, we already have a signed BRBC in place. Okay, so we can't fill this out and then sign the BRBC. And just so you know, if I'm sending out, if I've got a buyer, because it's actually happened to me, I've got a buyer who didn't need to see the property. They knew the property. It was actually a vacant lot. I didn't go show them the property. It was a vacant lot. But we're negotiating. They're like, called me up and said, hey, Amy, we've got this property we want to make an offer on. Can you write up the offer for us? I'm like, yes, absolutely. But here I am. I haven't shown them the property. I don't have a BRBC in place. So with my offer documents, I put in a BRBC, I put in the SPBB, but I was strategic in how they were signed, in how they went out in the signing order, so that the BRBC was the first document signed, then the offer, and then the SPBB. So if I went back and looked at the date stamp, this is completely accurate in that the BRBC was already signed. Okay, it was signed first. Okay, logistics, right? Does it really matter as long as it's still signed at the same time? Probably not, but I just, for my conscious of this saying, hey, I've already got a BRBC, a signed BRBC in place, I wanted to make sure that was first in my signing order. So signing order is important to me. I would make sure it was important to you as well, just so you're beyond reproach on that. Delivery of buyer representation agreement. If we're going to send the SPBB, a copy of our BRBC needs to also be included. Now, keep in mind that we only have to include the portion of the BRBC that indicates the amount of commission. So if you had a modification of terms adjusting the commission amount, just attaching that modification of terms is fine. Otherwise, all we have to do on the BRBC is go to the last page of the BRBC, which is the signature page. This automatically brings over in this confirmation of compensation, the commission that we write in on the grid. It's going to pull it over automatically for you. So this last page of the BRBC, page 5, is the only page that you have to include with the SPBB. We do not have to include a copy of the entire BRBC. They don't need to know all the other terms. They just need to know what the compensation was that the buyer agreed to pay. Because the seller has no obligation to pay more than what's on this form or more than what's on that modification of terms. Okay, we're going to sign this. This gets submitted with our offer. SPBB form. Okay, again, we have to have the BRBC or a PSRA signed to show properties. We have to have a BRBC or a PSRA in order to use the SPBB form to negotiate that commission. Okay, please, please, please get your compensation in writing. Okay. We talked about the cancellation of representation. The only other form that applies to this buyer that you might come across, or that you might want to include the second that you get into contract on a property, is the buyer material issues for a specific property form. It talks about this form in the BRBC. It also, I believe, talks about it in the RPA. Okay, so this form comes into play. I think it's a solid form to make sure the buyer has a copy of, because what it says is buyer obligation to disclose material issues. In accordance with the buyer representation agreement, buyer has agreed to notify broker in writing of any material issues to buyer, such as, but not limited to, buyer's request for information on or concerns regarding any issue of interest or importance to buyer, material issues. The following are material issues to the buyer regarding the property specified below or above. Sorry, property specified above. We're going to put the property information in there. I'm just going to give them this blank form. Hey, at any time you've got issues, questions, concerns, you want me to ask the seller, you've got concerns on this property, we're not sure, right? Just write them down. That way I can just take the buyer's written statement of what their questions, what their concerns, if they have any issues or interest of importance to the buyer related to this property, and submit it over to the seller for review to get answers. instead of me taking what the buyer tells me and then I translate it to the seller or the listing agent, right? Things can get lost in translation. I've got the buyer's actual concerns and statements here that I can pass on to get answers for them or clarification on. So this is the buyer material issues for a specific property. Again, I would give a buyer just the blank form that, hey, we're in contract. If there's any issues that come up, you've got questions, you want more information on something, something that's an area of interest or issue for you regarding this property, I want you just to jot it down on this form for me and then give me a copy of it. Okay, once you give me a copy of it, I'm gonna give you another form or a blank one, or if you need an additional form, just let me know. I'm happy to get you another copy of it. But this way, if you've got any questions or concerns, that way I can take this form and get those answers for you directly from the seller or the listing agent. Does that sound good? And they're gonna be like, oh yeah, that's amazing, right? I can guarantee you that if Realty One Group starts using the BIPP form, which is the buyer identification of preferences and priorities, we start using that buyer financial and personal information form. We start using the buyer material issues form, right? Giving that to buyers when they enter into contract or even before they enter into contract, saying, hey, as we move through this, if you end up with any questions or concerns once we enter into a contract, we're going to use this form so that I can directly ask the seller for those answers. They go talk to another buyer's agent, they're not going to get that kind of service. They're not going to get that kind of clarity on what it is that they're looking for. They're not going to get that reassurance from them that they're looking out for their best interests. They're going to come back and be like, hey, Michelle, I know I said I was talking with a couple agents, but oh my gosh, you were so thorough and you gave us so many options and you really seem like you know what you're doing. I want to use you. Okay, because you went above and beyond to make sure you gained clarity on what it was that they're looking for. Make sure you knew what they were comfortable with payment-wise, where their funds were coming from, what their wants and desires were with the property, and then make sure that they knew they had a way to ask questions directly to the seller with this form. You're gonna steal the show, I promise. Questions, thoughts, or concerns? All right, was this training helpful? So quiet. Michelle says yes. Vanessa also says yes. Yeah, I got a thumbs up from Anna. Thank you. I'm glad you guys found this helpful and useful. I believe next week, although don't take my word for it. Let's see if I can pull up my calendar real quick. I believe next week we're talking about the listing forms. Let's see, we're on Wednesday. Yes, we're talking about the RLA and the MLSA. So we'll be discussing that next week. So we're diving into the seller side of how this transaction works. Michelle, let's see here. I know that you said it's making better sense now that you've written some offers. Perfect. I knew that as you put things together, it would make a little bit more sense. It's hard as a new agent coming in to understand. And we keep talking about changes. And the new agents are like, these aren't changes. This is just how we're learning to do it. So you guys are really, truly going to have the advantage, I promise. But thank you for joining me today. We're back tomorrow. We're going to talk about getting your business started correctly. So we'll talk about kind of all the tools and things you can do to set yourself up as a new agent appropriately, so that you don't make the same errors lots of us older agents made when we got our business started. So we'll be diving into that tomorrow. If you have any trainings you would like to see me do, throw them in. There's a link in the chat box. You can click on that. You can throw them in that Google form of suggested trainings. Otherwise, I will see you all tomorrow. Thank you for joining me today. And as always, if you have questions, feel free to reach out.